Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 2020 Shirley Kheel lecture on reproductive endocrinology. I would like to thank the Jones Institute Foundation for their support throughout the years for research and education at the Jones Institute and for supporting this really very important lecture for us. I would like to really thank our speakers, Dr. Eli Adashi, Dr. Alan DeCherney, and Dr. Susan Conklin for really coming to spend time with us and share a lot of their scientific knowledge with us today. I'd like to thank also Laurel for putting this together and for supporting with her team women with infertility and reproductive endocrinology issues in our community, nationally and internationally. Great day for EVMS to host the Kheel lecture. I'm honored to be introducing Laurel and our illustrious speakers this morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
Very, very good friends and colleagues with Dr. Jones. And it's 38 and a half years since the birth of Elizabeth Carr, and soon it will be 40 years. And both speakers were here at the beginning of IVF, and it was not so long ago that Dr. Jones had his 100th birthday, and we still all miss him dearly, and this is also dedicated to him. So Shirley Kheel, from the very beginning, even before any successful IVF births, she was convinced that with the aid of modern medicine and the Joneses' expertise that she could conceive a child. She was rewarded by the birth of her son, David Duncan Kheel, in 1982, the fifth IVF baby born in Norfolk. But unfortunately, she died of cancer in 1994.
Recording has started.
And her passion for helping the other infertile couples lives on through this memorial endowment. It's been a little while. It's been about 8 years since we've had a Kheel Lectureship, so we're so excited to have two speakers this year who are just the pioneers in the field. And now I guess David's about, I don't have a recent picture of him, he must be in his mid-30s. These are some of the speakers from past lectures. The last one was Marcel Cedars in 2012. Dr. DeCherney is making a repeat performance. So Dr. Adashi, who's going to remotely speak. Both of these, we could go on and on about all their accolades, but he basically was from Tel Aviv, and he trained as a fellow with Dr. Georgiana and Howard Jones, and also with Sam Yen in California. So he was a very, very good friend of Dr. Howard's throughout their lives. Both he and Dr. DeCherney, as you'll hear later, have been like presidents of all the major societies in REI, SGI, SRE, AGOS, and Dr. Adashi has a passion for access to care, and he did a program with the public health at Harvard, and he is very passionate about access to healthcare for all and ethics. Dr. DeCherney, who's the head at NIH and ICHD, he came by the way of residency at University of Pennsylvania that we heard a little bit about yesterday, and then he went to Yale, and he was at Yale, he was the fifth IVF program in the world was Yale. So he was there from the inception too, and he and Dr. Howard used to collaborate and try to figure out things in the early days. And actually, I am here because of Dr. DeCherney, because I did this rotation at Yale many years ago, and that's why I decided REI. And then he's from Yale, he went to California, UCLA as chair, and Tufts first, and then UCLA as chair, and he's been head at NIH fellowship program and the chief REI there. He is also president of all the ASRM, SART at one point, editor for many, many years of the Fertility and Sterility Journal. I've got to leave time for him to speak. But, and actually, Dr. Adashi and DeCherney were both my board examiners when I took my board. And I think I killed a patient with severe OHSS during my boards, but I guess I'm still here. And Dr. DeCherney knew everything about PCOS, and that was my thesis. So, well, March Madness, let the games begin.
Is that true? They're not going to be postponed? I thought they were going to be postponed.
Okay.
Great. Okay. And this advances it?
I think this is he.
Huh? Oh, perfect. Okay, great.
Yeah, this is DeCherney.
Okay, the theme of this morning is going to be mitochondrial disease. It's important because it's an important disease, but it's also the beginning of gene engineering. Ellie will talk a lot about the ethical aspects of it. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the biology of it. Let me just make sure that's right. Okay. So as you know, this is three baby. It's got a lot of press over this, three-parent babies. Now, a lot of things we do are three-parent babies. Why this became a code for mitochondrial transfer, I don't know, but it's highly controversial. Not that everything in IVF hasn't been controversial for the last 40 years, but this too is extremely controversial. So how did I get involved? I'm a member of the National Academy, and they had a symposium in the National Academy of Medicine on mitochondrial disease. The charge was to say that it was it's a text message. So so our job, the FDA looked at it as a procedure. It was our job to construct an ethical framework for it to move forward as far as a treatment for patients. Okay. Just some brief biology. The mitochondria are the energy of the cell. They're small as far as the amount of DNA. You can see the nuclear DNA is much more, 3 billion bases. This has 16,500 bases. So it's a small part of the genome, but it's independent. It's an independent piece. It has absolutely nothing to do with phenotype. It only has to do with energy in the cell. Oh, you'll hear some things that if you modify the mitochondria, you have a little bit more energy. This has not been proven. The truth is that it has nothing to do with phenotype. So therefore, it's the perfect thing to start looking at gene therapy because you're really not interfering much with what people really are. And this, the left side, just looks at regular DNA. The right side looks at regular DNA, and the left side looks at mitochondrial DNA. You can see that it's tremendously different. The key is that all the mitochondria comes from the mother. The sperm has 100 mitochondria. They're rapidly dispersed as soon as the sperm goes in. But the cytoplasm, up to 300,000 mitochondria are in the egg cytoplasm, and that's what's transferred to the fetus. Now there are multiple diseases, and I saw Ellie's going to talk a little bit. I just want to one word about the last thing, the Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. These patients go about age 30, they go blind. So it's a profound disease, and many of these kids have tremendous muscular problems growing up. And then there's also a subtle form that people don't even know that they have it. It's just as they get to be 30 and 40, they just become weaker and weaker, and they don't have the same amount of stamina. There's no statistics for how many people have that because they're not tested. So the treatment is relatively simple, and actually the embryologists say it's pretty simple as far as the technique is concerned. The top is spindle transfer, and the bottom is pronuclear transfer. So what you do is let's go to the bottom first. You fertilize an egg, so it's the wife and husband. They fertilize. I don't know, are those terms are okay? Can you still talk about wife and husband, or otherwise it's hard to say who they are. And then you make an early embryo, a zygote, and then you transfer it to a donor cytoplasm. And the other is just to take the spindle mechanism from the egg, put it into the donor cytoplasm, and then fertilize it with the husband's sperm. This is, in a way, considered by purists an abortion, the lower part, because you have to destroy the nucleus of the donor egg for the cytoplasm. So it's considered an abortion. It looks easier when you look at it geographically, but the truth is they say that spindle transfer, I'm not an embryologist, they say that that's fine. So so that's where we started with our deliberations. And Ellie will go into greater detail. I'm just going to tell you how a clinician looks at this. The concern is you're changing the germline. So if someone 10 generations from now, let's say the person comes from Norway, so the nucleus is from Norwegian parents, but the cytoplasm comes from Hungary. 10 generations from now, they'll say that you have Hungarian ancestry. Well, the truth is you don't have Hungarian. That was just a donor. So we debated this. I cannot tell you how many hours. To me, give the person a card that they transfer from generation to generation that explains what happens, and there won't be any confusion. But of course, it's never that simple. So, okay. So spindle transfer we just looked at. It doesn't destroy embryos. No harm to donors. There was a question of parthenogenesis, but that's never been proven. So this is the technique that people are beginning to utilize. It's being done in England now. It has been done in the United States that we're not going to talk about. The other solution is surrogacy. So as you know, surrogacy would be fine. It's not the mother's egg. And therefore it's a donor, it's just another form of a donor egg. Well, why surrogate? Why just not a donor egg and let the mother carry the baby? Because I mentioned some of these women they're carriers and they're not very sick, but they could be weak, and it would be a pregnancy would be a challenge in those women. So that's why surrogacy is one of the options. The option that I don't have, the first day of our deliberations was people, the lay public, coming in to tell us about this. And most of the people that came to talk to us were patients, and those patients said that their child was severely affected. Their option was not to have any more children. So I don't talk about that, but certainly that's something that is an option that people have taken. The other is a gestational carrier, also utilizing the mother's egg, the husband's sperm, and let them carry that as far as the risk of pregnancy is concerned. CVS is okay, and it's not terribly accurate because it's not reproducible. Every cell that would be biopsied doesn't necessarily reflect the amount of abnormal mitochondria in the cell. And in fact, it's a problem because if you have 5% mitochondrial, abnormal mitochondrial tissue or cells, they can perpetuate greater in number than the normal mitochondrial cells. So it's very tricky. You have to have less than 2% abnormal mitochondria in order for any of these techniques to be predictive and to be successful. Adoption, of course, is always an option for these patients. An egg donor is also an option. Just use the sperm, and then you could use a gestational carrier if the woman has somewhat problems, or the patient can cover themselves. Now, the issue here is this is an easy cure. Clinically, because the baby would be normal, because the cytoplasm is not the cytoplasm, but it's not the genetic material of the mother. And the interesting thing about this panel, there were 3 physicians and 7 ethicists, and they didn't understand the fact that patients wanted their own genetic material. I mean, they thought this was an easy cure, just, use a donor. I said, we make our living by giving people their own genetic material. It's a very strong human desire to have children that are your own, their own genetic, parents' only genetic material. And the same with the PGS, as I said, they're well aware of mosaicism, so it might not be an accurate judge of what the mitochondria is like. And also heteroplasmy means that it's mixed, as I mentioned, and that there's 2% in one cell and 20% in another cell. So it's difficult to use PGS as a screen as far as this is concerned. Okay. Now, another concern is utilize this for cytoplasmic transfer. The theory is that you can make old eggs young again by transferring young mitochondria into the egg. That was part of our report. That's not to be done. It doesn't work. There's no indication that is successful. So cytoplasmic transfer is not something that's espoused. It seems to have disappeared a little bit. It was popular a while ago. I think yes. So it was popular. Oviscience, of course, had a program where they were doing mitochondrial transfer, and this is kind of a disclaimer that they said that it increased the pregnancy rate, but that has not been confirmed. So cytoplasmic transfer is not something that's recommended. In fact, Jacques Cohen did it, probably 15 years ago to 20 patients. It didn't increase the pregnancy rate, and it seemed to be somewhat safe. But he was advised by the FDA not to do this because it is genetic engineering. That's just a disclaimer. So mitochondrial transfer as an add-on is not something that is recommended. This is just a list of add-ons. Add-ons are now being looked at as far as treatment is concerned. Most add-ons are not helpful in increasing the pregnancy rate, and definitely cytoplasmic transfer to enrich the cytoplasm of the egg with younger mitochondria is not something that works, but it comes over to the rubric of mitochondrial transfer, so that's why it's included here, but it's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about mitochondrial transfer in patients that have severe mitochondrial disease, mothers that carry that disease, and a way to avoid that by altering the genetic profile. Now, of course, this is all could disappear with CRISPR because, as you know, CRISPR is cutting out abnormal genes, and in these mitochondrial diseases, it's only one gene that's abnormal, or maybe just one small cluster of genes, so that would be treatable, and so that might eliminate all of the need for this if you could just treat the mitochondria early in the development stage of the oocyte. The problem now, of course, is there's lateral damage. Change a little bit of the gene. You don't know what's going to happen to other genes. But this is a technique that will be perfected. It definitely works. There's 2 papers. Here's this paper from partially from Japan, and this from China, where CRISPR was carried out in embryos that weren't transferred. These were triploidy nuclei. The other way to do this, to change this, is epigenetic changes in the sperm, so that you could change the mitochondrial construct at fertilization. I don't think that has a lot of promise for this, but it does have promise for other ways of genetic engineering. So the biology seems simple. The solution that seems simple. So why do we debate this? Because everything that's been done in ART since Steptoe and Edwards. In fact, Edwards didn't get the Nobel Prize for 20 years after he did the first IVF. There were multiple reasons. There were political reasons he didn't get it. But the major reason is that the Nobel Prize Committee would not give him the Nobel Prize until they were sure that the second generation was normal. So they had to wait for baby Brown to have a child until he got the Nobel Prize, because that child was and is normal. So this, it's science fiction. It stirs up a lot of imagination and a lot of concern by the public about genetic engineering. But this is a relatively safe way, as I started out saying. It doesn't alter the phenotype, so therefore this is a good way at least to start, because these are severely affected people that have profound mitochondrial disease, and what we can do to help them is certainly welcome. And I'll end just with lead into Ellie's talk. Informed consent is a major problem because you can't tell patients what's going to happen, although we guess what's going to happen. There's some animal work, and we debated, should the child be informed when they're old enough to understand what happened? That's, to me, a little interesting, but we debated that a long time. Should part of the agreement with the parents and the donor that the child eventually would sign a consent, although they didn't consent to it being done, they consented to the fact that they understood what was done. So how does the public feel about this in general? Oh, let me go back. So I'm going to give you a couple scenarios, and I want you to prioritize them as far as the public is concerned and their opinion. Muscular dystrophy, so doing gene therapy to prevent severe diseases. 2, Fanconi's anemia, where you have a child who's not affected, so you do PGD and have a non-affected child, and then you use that non-affected child, bone marrow, to treat the affected sibling. Now, you don't throw the child out, you have a child, you're not doing it just for a donor, but that's a therapy that has been used. The next is a patient with BRCA, BRC1 or 2. The next scenario is sex selection, and the third is trait selection, blue eyes, for instance. So think in your head, how do you prioritize that? And the truth, the way I gave it to you is the way the public looks about it. Treating disease is fine. The Fanconi's is fine. People were a little bit, public was a paper from Hopkins, people were a little bit concerned about the BRCA1 and 2 because they thought they could be treated and could be anticipated. But sex selection, not popular, and trait selection is extremely unpopular in the eyes of most of the public. And this study has been validated. Now, some crazy things happen, and that's another reason people don't like to start. This is a guy named Graham. Actually, he invented plastic lenses and became very rich. And he had a sperm bank where only the sperm donors had to be Nobel Prize winners, and the recipients had to be members of Mensa. It didn't work. He had one sperm donor that was a Nobel Prize. Somebody wrote a book. He had one person that was a Nobel Prize winner. So it didn't turn out to be successful. But certainly, this is a different kind of eugenics, and it certainly makes people kind of nervous what could be done. It's all seen in the movie Gattaca, and that's the end stage of genetic engineering, where only the patients or only people that were genetically engineered had a role in society, and that's because all their traits could be controlled. The truth is, the spontaneous birth was a better and more productive person than the gene engineered person. So this is translational medicine. This is very big where I work at the NIH, is bench to bedside of translational medicine. And this to me is great translational medicine because you're taking basic science, you have good understanding of what's happening, and you're treating a severe human disease. So our final report was positive. We said that it should be done. It should be done in males first, so that you didn't have the risk of transmitting that small portion of mitochondria that was abnormal that might have been transferred are surrounding the spindle mechanism. And the FDA, who paid for or initiated the report from the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, was happy with the report, and we were going to start to do it in the United States. They're ready to do it in Oregon. But there was a rider on a bill, and I'm sure Ellie will talk in detail about that, where this was terminated. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ellie. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Dr. Stadmeyer, Dr. Abu Hamad, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to follow up on Alan's presentation with a little more policy, since he covered much of the biology, and there is plenty of policy to talk about. That is not to say that the science part is unimportant, but as it turns out, on the whole, the science in the United States is in great shape and is still ongoing, primarily at the Oregon Health Sciences University, and you can expect a few papers coming out pretty soon with additional information on work that has been done on mitochondrial replacement therapy with non-human primates, in particular, 3 generations thereof, and a few other very important papers that I think are going to educate us all and to some degree modify our views. Briefly, as has already been stated, mitochondrial DNA diseases constitute rare diseases that are attributable to mutant mitochondrial DNA. It is estimated that about 1,000 US children are born annually with mitochondrial DNA disease. These children, as you can see, are often wheelchair bound. At other times, they are bedridden, and all too often oxygen starved. We can only begin to imagine what their parents are going through. Unfortunately, cure is not in the cards at present, and PGD, as you have heard, has been deemed unreliable in this context, which really leaves us only with prevention, and specifically with mitochondrial replacement therapy. The concept is a simple one, and as Alan has already illustrated, and I will schematically reiterate, the idea is to substitute mutant mitochondrial DNA in affected oocytes or zygotes with wild-type mitochondrial DNA from unaffected donor oocytes and zygotes through the intermediacy of IVF. As Alan mentioned, on February the 3rd, 2016, the National Academy of Medicine released its report, of which he was a member, titled Mitochondrial Replacement Techniques, wherein it essentially concluded that mitochondrial DNA diseases are amenable to prevention through mitochondrial replacement therapy, and that this technology is ethically permissible and eminently testable. It is important to note that mitochondrial replacement therapy, or at least the conceptualization thereof, was born in the USA. We sometimes think that this is a British invention, but in reality, this dates back to 1995 in the United States, specifically to Loyola University in Chicago, wherein a team of 4 reported effectively the protocol and the ethics of in vitro ovum transfer and nuclear transplantation, as they refer to it, which was meant to cure mitochondrial disease. The 4 individuals included from left to right Dr. Donald Rubenstein, then a resident in medicine, now a cardiologist, Dr. Tomasma, an ethicist from Loyola University who is no longer with us, Dr. Schoen, a mitochondrial scientist based at Columbia University in New York, and Michael Zinnemann, a reproductive endocrinologist, now with Albert Einstein University in New York. Those 4, in effect, are the fathers of mitochondrial replacement therapy. You might also be interested in the fact that at that time, that group was in close contact with Gary Hodgen, which at the time was the president of the Jones Institute for Reproductive Medicine. Shown here is a fax communication from Gary to Don Rubenstein, wherein he apologizes for his inability to co-author the paper, but expresses his hope that he could participate in the clinical project later on. This clinical project, as it was hoped for, never really came off, and as you also know, Dr. Hodgen sadly passed away in 2005. By 2014, the FDA felt that there was sufficient interest and sufficient preliminary information to warrant a public meeting on mitochondrial replacement therapy, and they convened such in Bethesda, Maryland, on February the 25th and the 26th of 2014. The title of the conference was Oocyte Modification in Assisted Reproduction for the Prevention of Transmission of Mitochondrial Disease or Treatment of Infertility. As it turns out, the outcome of this meeting proved to be somewhat irrelevant in that about a year later, Congress passed and the President signed into law a so-called renewable rider, which is an annually renewable statute that read, "None of the funds made available to the FDA may be used to acknowledge a submission for research in which a human embryo is modified to include heritable genetic modification." In effect, this rider precluded the conduct of clinical trials of MRT in the United States, as well as the possible down-the-line approval of this technology by the FDA. This so-called renewable rider has been religiously renewed every year, several times sometimes. The last renewal took place on December the 20th of last year. You may have noted that the renewable rider actually makes no mention of the word mitochondria. And indeed, it appears to be primarily aimed at heritable editing of the nuclear genome of the human embryo. Still, because the genetic makeup of the progeny of individuals treated for mitochondrial disease will in effect have been modified, albeit not edited, mitochondrial replacement therapy was in some way collateral damage, that an unwitting casualty, if you will, or caught in the crossfire of this renewable rider, which primarily was aimed at heritable genetic modification of the human embryo. In other words, CRISPR-edited gametes for human embryos. The congressional provenance of the renewable rider turned out to be the subcommittee in the House that appropriates the FDA, as well as some other agencies. It turns out that to the chair of this committee and his constituency, Mr. Robert B. Aderholt, a Republican representative from the state of Alabama, the issue of heritable genetic modification of the human embryo was a pro-life matter, and therefore needed to be outlawed or at least precluded by this legislation. The reason we know that is because those sentiments were in effect articulated on the floor of the House. Here is what Mr. Aderholt had to say on May the 3rd, 2017, in this short video clip, which I hope works.
The bill also includes a prohibition on gene editing of human embryos, and this is a tremendous victory for those who are concerned about life.
Some of the same came from the chair of the overall House Appropriation Committee, Representative Harold Rogers, a Republican representative from the state of Kentucky, who had the following to say on the floor of the House on December the 17th, 2015. I hope this works.
The bill also preserves the sanctity of life by carrying all existing pro-life policy and funding provisions from previous appropriations bills. It adds new provisions prohibiting genetic editing of human embryos and reduces UNFPA funding by 7%.
Just in case it didn't come through, I will simply reiterate that both gentlemen have addressed the issue of the sanctity of life and their concern that the editing of human embryo violates that principle. Ironically, as was mentioned by Alan, in the United States, if mitochondrial replacement therapy were to be carried out, it was likely to it was likely to be conducted by way of maternal spindle transfer, or MST, which only involves oocytes, and therefore is in effect embryo sparing. So the concerns about the possibility that maternal replacement therapy is somehow offensive to the sanctity of life and therefore requires prohibition is probably misguided, and that has been part of some of our advocacy in the halls of Congress in the last several years. In this context, I will mention a meeting that Professor Glenn Cohen at Harvard Law School and myself co-organized last year, and which Alan attended, wherein multiple elements of the equation were discussed, but also some legislative strategy was on the table. And as a result of that meeting, significant advocacy led by the ASRM and others took place on the Hill in the hope of educating some of the representatives as to mitochondrial replacement therapy. And as it turns out, some of that did in fact bear fruit, although we are hardly at the point where mitochondrial replacement therapy is out of trouble. Interestingly, shortly after that conference, the renewable rider all of a sudden disappeared from the FDA appropriation draft bill for about 2 months in the course of the appropriation process, although no public information was available as to how and why. It later turns out that the current chair of the Appropriation Subcommittee, Representative Sanford Bishop, a Democratic representative from the state of Georgia, pulled the rider out of the draft bill and did so in the hope of negotiating an agreement with his Republican colleagues so as to modify the rider so as to permit mitochondrial replacement therapy to proceed. That evidently failed because the rider was ultimately reintroduced, probably as a result of some give and take between the Democrats and the Republicans, the nature and the details of which are unknown to us. Nevertheless, this allowed the notion of mitochondrial replacement therapy to be aired in the House for the first time ever, which I will illustrate or try to in the next 2 video clips. In the first one, Mr. Bishop is addressing the Appropriation Subcommittee at this point during a markup session on June the 4th of 2019, wherein he does indeed do justice to mitochondrial replacement therapy. Let's hope this works.
I do want to note that I believe that there is a therapy that is prohibited by this language that can possibly address some devastating and fatal diseases of children. It is called mitochondrial replacement therapy. MRT should not be thought of as a genetic enhancement because it's not. It's a repair. The National Academy of Sciences looked at this at the request of FDA and concluded that, and I quote, "it is ethically permissible to conduct clinical investigations of MRT subject to certain conditions and principles laid out in their report."
He was not the only one who addressed mitochondrial replacement therapy. So did the chair of the overall House Appropriation Committee, Representative Nita Lowey, a Democratic representative from the state of New York, who is about to retire very soon, and who had the following to say about mitochondrial replacement therapy and the need for Congress to take it up going forward. Here's what she had to say in the Hope It Works.
4 years ago, without any debate, this rider was inserted into an appropriations bill. I believed then, as I believe now, that the authorizing committees of jurisdiction, with the guidance of the scientific community and full transparency, should debate the merits of this research. This rider amounted to a blanket denial for the FDA to review applications related to the modifications of an embryo without the merits of the individual case. I understand concerns that gene editing can allow for unsettling genetic enhancements which may be against our values. But it is also true that medical research, including in mitochondrial replacement therapy, could reduce suffering and save lives. While some may feel a moral obligation to oppose this research, others of us feel that we have a moral obligation to allow advances in science so fewer parents will have to watch a child die of a heritable disorder and to help eradicate terrible, deadly diseases that can be passed down from generation to generation. Other nations have standards for this type of research to take place. For instance, in the United Kingdom, mitochondrial replacement therapy is permitted under strict guidelines, including a license requirement and a finding that an individual with a mitochondrial abnormality poses a significant risk to pass on a serious mitochondrial disease to their child. It is my hope that the authorizing committees take note of this debate and do their oversight work on this matter and allow the appropriators to do what we do best, fund the important work of this nature.
The authorizing committees to which Representative Lowry made reference to are FDA authorizing committees that have the opportunity to call for meetings, call in witnesses, and explore issues such as mitochondrial replacement therapy. Such committees include the House Committee on Energy and Commerce and its Subcommittee on Health, or the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, or its Subcommittee on Primary Health and Retirement Security. There are also non-FDA authorizing committees, so-called, which have the ability to convene and discuss issues. They include the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology and its Subcommittee on Research and Technology, the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and its Subcommittee on Manufacturing, Trade, and Consumer Protection, as well as on Science, Oceans, Fisheries, and Weather. Which brings us to 2020 and as to where we are today with the issue of mitochondrial replacement therapy. Some education appears to have transpired such that some members of Congress are now more facile with mitochondrial replacement therapy are in fact generally supportive. I can also say that although not quite to the same degree, some of the Republican members of the House subcommittee that appropriates the FDA have also assumed a more favorable position towards MRT, although whether or not they are ready to revise or modify the rider, and all it would take, by the way, is a single word change, whether or not they're ready to do so remains to be seen. I think it's safe to say that very little, if anything, will happen during 2020. This is a tumultuous election year, and it's highly doubtful that anything of consequence along these lines will transpire. Uncertainty remains through 2021 simply because much will depend on the outcome of the elections. Depending on how the House and the Senate segregate and who ends up occupying the White House, that collectively will, I think, determine, among other things, the fate of MRT and related technologies. For the time being, we all need to keep in mind the Hippocratic imperative, and that is our responsibility to see to it that the kind of human suffering that these children are exposed to, that we put a stop to it one way or the other, hopefully sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ellie and Alan. And you may have heard that we're going through some transition to exciting times, and that there's a merger with EVRMA Global and EVMS for the Jones Institute. And Jason Fernasiak is going to say a few words representing the EVRMA.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for allowing me just a few minutes to speak to you all this morning. It was certainly an honor to be here and to hear the Kheel lecture. Dr. DeCherney and Dr. Adashi gave an excellent overview and a very fascinating talk regarding the intersection of something which has both medical, political, and ethical implications. And I think that there is certainly much more to see when it comes to this topic in the coming years. I did just want to briefly speak with everybody this morning about the joint venture, which has now occurred between EVRMA and the Jones Institute, and give just a brief overview of what EVRMA is and a couple of the significant pillars in terms of research and innovation and education that we stand for and will hopefully bring to collaborate with the Jones Institute and their significant history of education and research that's done here. So in terms of EV and RMA, EV was founded in 1990 by Doctors Pellicer and Ramoe. They established what was essentially the first clinic which was dedicated to reproductive medicine. In 1999, RMA was founded by Doctors Berg, Drews, and Scott, and it represents one of the largest fertility and reproductive endocrine clinics in the country. The two were merged in 2017 and now represent the largest reproductive endocrinology and fertility group in the world. As such, we have clinics in 11 different countries, and there are over 65 clinics. And that has comprised in the 2018 over 27,000 ART cycles. One of the things that we're very dedicated to and proud of is the fact that EVRMA is the single largest investor in reproductive endocrinology and infertility research in the world. As noted, there are more than 65 centers in 11 countries, and all of them participate in self-funded research. And this has to do with the fact that much of the governmental regulations which exist prohibit research done in vitro fertilization, and as such, many of the profits which are brought into the organization are turned right back into research. The EVRMA organization has given birth to, or has helped with the birth of over 200,000 babies since 1990, and involves over 7 research centers, 70 investigators, and 15 different lines of research. And it has ultimately culminated in nearly 2,000 scientific publications just from the EVRMA network. EVRMA America is the organization which oversees all of the America clinics and is underneath the EVRMA global umbrella. It is now 22 clinics large and represents 50 physicians across the United States. It initiated in New Jersey and then expanded to Pennsylvania and then ultimately to Florida and California. And we're very, very honored to be adding Virginia and the 3 clinics here to the list, the clinics in Norfolk, Newport News, and Virginia Beach. Just wanted to briefly touch on 2 of the major pillars of the EVRMA organization, that of innovation and research and education. In terms of reproductive medicine and research, it is our innovation pipeline, which kind of governs this process. There are over 350 active projects which are going on in the EVRMA network, and this comprises over 70 researchers in 7 different research locations. And this is a list of the various areas that research and investigation are ongoing and largely comprise nearly every aspect of reproductive endocrine and infertility. As noted, we have published a number of different trials, nearly 2,000 different publications, and this includes over a dozen randomized controlled trials. Again, many of these randomized controlled trials are self-funded, and involve giving away significant amounts of care in order to enroll patients. We've given away over 1,000 free IVF cycles and nearly 800 free embryo screening tests. And many of these things that we work on have to do with translational medicine. So working from the research world to the clinical world in short order, trying to improve the care that we bring to patients and the safety of that care. One of the main things that we have worked on has been improving the rates of elective single embryo transfer, and the doing so has dramatically reduced the incidence of multiple pregnancies and ultimately increased implantation, full-term pregnancy, and delivery of healthy babies. At RMA, 97% of all transfers involve one embryo, and the twin rate that we have in the practice, as well as the very low birth weight, are low, and in fact are equivalent to the rates of natural conception. So conception with fertility care has the same outcomes as natural conceptions. One of the other main pillars is the global education, and there are several different components to the global education brand. There is instruction, which has to do with online courses or courses delivered by various clinics, as well as master's programs, which exist. And in all of our clinics, we have residents and fellows which rotate through with us. There's also training and consulting, which goes on, which are organizations or clinics which approach EVRMA in order to participate in educating them both in the reproductive endocrine fields as well as the embryology fields. And then we have our biannual Congress. The EVRMA Congress was most recently held in 2019. We will hold another in 2021. There were over 1,600 participants, and this represents the third largest infertility conference in the world behind ESHRA and ASRM. In addition, the EVRMA groups have been recognized for many of its investigations, over 45 awarded studies from organizations like SRI, SSR, ASRM, and ESHRA, and all of these things to say that we're certainly very proud of the work that our investigators do. We think that it really does help to change the way that we care for patients. And we're just really excited about the fact that we get to now partner with the Jones Institute. This organization here has a legacy that is just remarkable in our field, and it has a history that is unrivaled in our community. We're very excited to be partnering with the Jones Institute and Eastern Virginia Medical School, and we're looking forward to hopefully having a great partnership moving forward, both in the clinical, research, and educational areas. Again, appreciate everybody's time this morning. Thanks so much.
Don't really have time for questions, but you could. Anything pressing? I think again the
meeting. Yeah, are we excited?